We'll get started. Hello, and welcome to Reparations 101, our third webinar short of 2023, which will provide an overview of reparations through a global lens. My name is Ashley Nelson, and I am the Director of Communications at the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience. I'm going to provide a brief introduction and pass it quickly to our wonderful presenter. For those of you joining us for the first time, the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, ICSC, or the Coalition for short, is the only global network of historic sites, museums, and memory initiatives that connect past struggles to today's movements for human rights and social justice. Founded in 1999, we now have over 350 members in 65 countries, from Ellis Island in New York City to former centers of detainment in Argentina, to sites that remember and learn from the transatlantic slave trade in West Africa. While our members focus on a range of subjects, what connects them is their belief that history should be used as a transformative tool for positive change. At Sites of Conscience, memory is considered to be the best weapon civil society has against injustice. By remembering the world's most challenging periods and giving voice to those who have been historically silenced, Sites of Conscience seek justice for harms done so that peaceful futures may take root. In short, we preserve memory, promote truth, and pursue justice. For information on how to join the coalition, please visit our website. Our 2023 webinar series entitled If Memory Serves on the Uses and Abuses of Memory, Remembering, examines the many roles memory plays in contemporary topics and conversations on social justice, from the war in Ukraine to Black Lives Matter, drawing on the experience of survivors, scholars, practitioners, and most of all, Sites of Conscience, who for over 20 years have functioned as laboratories designed to find the most effective, ethical, and equitable uses of memory. Webinars generally take place on the third Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. New York time, and are followed a week later by a webinar short, which is a brief 20 to 30 minute webinar, usually offering Sites of Conscience and their allies more practical tools for effectively using history to address social justice today. They are free and open to the public. Please visit our events page on our website for more information. Our talk today will last about an hour. I'll begin with a short intro, and then we'll jump into the conversation. At the end, there will be a Q&A. Attendees may submit questions throughout the discussion into the Q&A box. They're not the chat box. The moderator will see them and read them out loud. I'm sorry, I'm going to make a correction. Our presentation today will last about 20 to 30 minutes, not an hour, and it will focus on the subject of reparations, a word often referred to in the media and politics, but that is not always understood. We're here today to learn more about their purpose. How might they be dispersed, to whom, and what role do they have in connecting ideas of justice to the legacies of slavery in the United States? To guide us through this is our dear colleague, Ereshnee Naidu, Senior Director of our Global Initiative for Justice, Truth, and Reconciliation, which is a consortium led by ICSC of 9 global organizations that works alongside communities to amplify the voices of survivors and inspire collective action in countries struggling to confront human rights violations. I'm going to hand it to Ereshnee now, and we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Good day, everybody. Next slide, Cassidy. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reparations. When we think about reparations, often in the United States, we think about it as compensation mainly. But reparations is much broader than that. And some of the goals of reparations are outlined in the basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations for victims of gross human rights violations. So firstly, what is compensation? Compensation is usually a monetary amount. It should be provided for economic damage. In the case of physical harm, lost opportunity, for example, if people lose their employment, and costs for perhaps legal, medical, and other kind of expert services. So that's compensation. Restitution is provided for people who have lost land, particularly. It's also a way to restore liberty, restore identity, and particularly human rights. Next slide, Cassidy. Another goal for reparations is to guarantee non-repetition. So this is institutional reform. So for example, reforming the judiciary, the police system, and monitoring conflicts and their resolution mechanisms so that it does not happen again. The fourth goal of reparations is for rehabilitation purposes. Often during conflict, people go through lots of psychological trauma, they physically injured and need medical assistance. So rehabilitation aims to assist them with some of these issues and provide social services as well as legal services. And finally, the last goal is the goal of satisfaction. And this may include a guarantee to stop the violence. So for example, in the US, we looking at police brutality. One of the goals of satisfaction could be monitoring the police system very closely, ensuring that they follow protocol, that kind of thing. It's also the search for the missing and disappeared. This also includes memorialization initiatives such as an apology or commemorative events, putting up memorials, monuments, museums, that kind of thing. Next slide. So the aims of reparations programs. Most reparations programs aim to rebuild civic trust. So often during a conflict, there's a certain group that's the out group and there's a group that's the in group. So by providing reparations for the group that's outside of the society, the group that has been injured, victims of the victim group, it allows them to rebuild trust with the state, with other citizens, so that they can become part of the society again, and it also builds inclusivity. Reparations, while most transitional justice mechanisms, particularly truth-telling mechanisms like truth commissions, are backward-looking because it looks at the past to address the past, to make amends. Reparations are very future-looking. So it's looking at how to rebuild a society in the future based on justice. It also builds solidarity by talking about some of these issues in public. It raises a broader awareness amongst the broader public where there's often silences around what happened. Victims are often ostracized for being victims. And then there's bystanders who refuse to recognize what happened and say they don't know what happened. So by raising awareness around these issues through a reparations program, it helps build empathy and therefore solidarity. Finally, it recognizes citizenship. It's a recognition through citizenship and democracy. So in most conflict regions, it's the state that's violating human rights. So they needs to rebuild that relationship between the state and citizens. So the state needs to show that they would provide safety and security for their citizens. So by giving reparations, it's an acknowledgement, as well as recognizing that they are citizens of this country and rebuilding the democracy and rule of law. Finally, it's a question of justice. Often when we talk to survivors and victims, one would think that they would want prosecutions, they would want to seek some kind of formal accountability. However, for many survivors and victims, reparations is a form of justice. It's a recognition of something that has been done that was not fair. One of the things I want to point out here is the question of proportionality. In the criminal justice system, particularly, when there's a wrong that has been done, basically people would be compensated, the victim would be compensated in proportion to what the wrong was done. However, in a transitional justice process, we can't really apply the question of proportionality because there's no way you can make up for some of the wrongs that have been done to victims. So for example, if somebody lost their child during the conflict, you cannot bring back the child. So you cannot give them, no matter how much money you give them, no matter how much of land restitution you give them, there's no way you can bring back the child. So the question of proportionality doesn't apply to that. Secondly, if, for example, a woman was raped, there's no way that you could take away that stigma. There's no way you can take away, heal her in any way and give her back what she lost during the violation. So the question of proportionality doesn't apply to reparations. In most cases, even if it is compensation, it's symbolic in nature. It doesn't meet the injustice that was done. Next slide. So I'm gonna talk about two countries where that recently ended their transitional justice process. One was Colombia, and the second was the Gambia. So Colombia undertook a transitional justice process following the peace agreement. And Colombia had already had a comprehensive reparation system in place. However, it was defunct. And this is an issue that's very common in the field of reparations, where there's no real political will to provide reparations. And in most cases, the state refuses to acknowledge that something wrong was done. So in Colombia, the Truth Commission made a recommendation for the victims unit and the land restitution unit to become more effective and also become facilitate a participatory process of including victims in the process. So in many cases, it's often a top-down approach where victims are excluded from the process, yet it is about them. The most effective reparations programs have been those that consulted closely with victims. However, again, it's a case of political will where, depending on a regime or if there's a regime change, the regime refuses to support victims through a reparations program. The Colombian Transitional Justice Truth Commission made recommendations for institutional reform, land restitution, the development of public policies of memory, including memorialization, public cultural programs for peace, curriculum reform, and environmental rights. Also interesting to note for the Colombia case, Colombia was one of the few first countries that actually recognized the environment and the land as being a victim of the violence. So environmental rights was a way of giving back to the land and really raising up and holding up the issue of land rights. Next slide, please. So Gambia is a country in West Africa. They recently completed their Truth Commission process. And they had an authoritarian, a dictator essentially, who committed several human rights violations. So there were two types of reparations that were provided by the Truth Commission. There were reparations in the form of medical support, housing, tuition fees for education. And most of these reparations happened during the time of the Truth Commission and were considered symbolic in nature and were titled emergency reparations. This was based on the South African Truth Commission's reparation process, where the South African Truth Commission also realized that victims were in urgent need of, for example, medical services, psychological services. So they also provided urgent interim reparations. The TRRC began distributing reparations through monetary compensation towards the end of its mandate. These reparations, as I said, similar to the South African process, was called interim reparations, and were provided where victims would receive cash on a pro rata basis. Some of the challenges that they faced, and this you would find across reparations programs around the world, is that there's an administrative question. So essentially, there needs to be a database of victims, and often some victims are left out of that database. Some victims are doubled up on that database. So there's administrative issues. But in addition to that, things like interim reparations are not sustainable. So it would pay 2 years of schooling, for example, for a child of a victim, but then there's no funding after that for the child. Also, they needed like people who need sustained medical care. Interim reparations were not something that was useful for them. The positive thing that came out of the Gambian Truth Commission is that they are currently drafting a reparations bill, and it's a very consultative process that includes victims, civil society, as well as government officials. Next slide, please. So bring it back to the US. There has been a tendency of the West to apologize, but always with a disclaimer that there will be no reparations given. And this takes basically does not serve the purposes of reparations, because while it recognizes that victims have been done, there's been wrong done, it doesn't provide any mechanisms to combat that ill treatment or that wrong. So, for example, Germany recently in May 2021 finally apologized for the genocide against the Herero people, who were the indigenous people in Namibia. And most of the population was decimated because the Germans were trying to take over the land. So while the German government apologized, there was no reparations attached to it. Later, following negotiations between the German government and the Namibian government, the German government has agreed to provide some kind of money for development, for community development. However, there's still arguments among victims groups and NGOs supporting victims that this is not reparations, because it's development. Reparations needs to actually acknowledge that something was done wrong, and we are giving, whether it's this money for community development, or whether we're putting in increased services for a specific community, because X, Y, and Z was done wrong to them. Similarly, the Dutch government apologized for slavery in January 2023 in Curaçao. Again, there was no financial compensation attached to that, no community reparations attached to that. So that's been the trend that has been happening over the past few years. I just want to talk a little bit now about some of the apologies that have happened in the US and where reparations was paid and hasn't been. So in 2008, the House apologized for slavery and Jim Crow, again with a disclaimer, and this was not publicized very widely as well. If you ask many people in the US, most people don't know that there was an apology, but it had a disclaimer that there would be no reparations paid. In Tuskegee, the experiment where African-American men were basically infected with syphilis virus. And in 1997, the unethical practices were uncovered. Bill Clinton apologized for that, and there was a settlement of $10 million. The Japanese internment during the World War, Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act in 1988, and there was a formal apology where $20,000 was paid to each family. Just to bring it back to the 2008 apology, that came from lots of advocacy and lots of lobbying. And the argument from most senators who were lobbying for this and trying to pass this was that there were multiple apologies in the history of the US. However, the US government refused particularly to apologize for slavery and for Jim Crow, which affected African Americans. Recently, there's been an increase in reparation studies at a local government level, at a state level, And there's been multiple task forces that have been set up to study reparations, study the impact, and make recommendations for reparations. So, for example, in Boston established a reparations task force in early 2023 to study the impact of slavery. In California, that's a reparations task force that's been highly publicized, was established by the California Assembly in 2020 to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans. In Palm Springs, Latino and Black community was raised. There was an apology offered, but no restitution. So currently the survivors from that community are trying to advocate for a land restitution. And finally, Senator Barbara Lee has been instrumental in pushing for a study to develop recommendations for reparations and an establishment of a truth commission. That has not been received very well, even by the current Biden administration. And there's also lots of, I just want to say also within the reparations community, there's, it's not a cohesive community. So people are always wanting to claim different forms of reparations and need different things. So even with these, the bills that Senator Barbara Lee is trying to push forward, there's two different groups, one trying to establish the reparations study and another one trying to establish the Truth Commission. And there's no agreement on which should come first. So some people are saying that if there's an establishment of the Truth Commission, fine, government will say, we've established the Truth Commission, that's it, we're not going to do anything further around reparations. Others are saying if they agree to develop a reparations study, it may not be enforceable. And so there's no need to look at a reparations study. They should actually look at developing a reparations policy. Next slide. So there's a few factors to consider when designing and implementing a reparations program. The first and foremost, it needs to be victim-centered, and victims need to be a central part of the process of designing and developing the reparations schemes, because victims know what they want and they need to have a voice in the process. It needs to be comprehensive and cohesive. So as I said, while apology may be a part of the reparations program, it's not the end all and be all of the reparations program. So there needs to be multiple forms of reparations linked to the document I showed you earlier about the right to remedy, so that it fulfills multiple goals. In talking to the South African Truth Commissioner about the recommendations that they made for reparations, she said that they didn't want the reparations program to be something like a road accident fund, where it was just this generic thing that all victims had. So they put lots of thought into what the reparations program should look like. The South African Truth Commission was probably one of the first truth commissions that had such a holistic and cohesive set of reparations recommendations. However, it failed in the sense that the government didn't fully implement and fulfill some of those reparations recommendations. The other thing when considering a reparations program is to consider gender disparities. So often in conflict situations, in violent situations, women don't see themselves as victims and survivors, yet women are the ones that are supporting the household, for example, when male members are killed, when male members go out to war. And so the role of women, for example, in this whole conflict situation needs to be considered. That's just one example of considering gender disparities. And finally, we need to look at funding sources. You could look at domestic funds. There could be a victim support fund that's set up by government. It could come through private donations. It could come through international assistance. as well as seized assets from perpetrators. I want to end by saying that as much as civil society could support reparations programs, as much as, sorry, I got distracted, as much as reparations, civil society can support reparations programs, the role of fulfilling a reparations strategy lies within the government and the state, because the state, as I said, has a relationship with its citizens within the territory. And one of the contracts that the state has with its citizens is to keep the citizens safe. So it's the role of the state to provide reparations in any context. So for example, we often hear in some countries where a government will argue, I was not part of this, the violation, so why should my government pay for reparations? So for example, in South Africa, even though the ANC-led government did not commit the human rights violations, it was the apartheid government, the ANC government paid the reparations because they recognized that it was their role as government to pay reparations, but also to recommit to their citizens' safety. So I'm going to leave it there and happy to take any questions now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ereshnee. I hate to say there was a technical issue with this webinar, and many attendees were not given the registration link until well into the webinar. So we will be sharing this webinar with all the registrants, and it will be available in full online on our events page. Eresh, I just had you spoke to it a little bit at the end, but I was just wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit more about the role of civil society in the reparations process. How can people get involved if a local community sort of wants to start something? Any suggestions?
Sure. I think the South African example is a good example because the South African Truth Commission report made recommendations for reparations, saying that most of this should be undertaken by the state. However, different parts of society have a role to play. So for example, the media had a role, civil society organizations had a role, big business had a role who benefited from apartheid. And I think our role as working with victims' communities is to provide a platform for them to share their needs, their experiences, and what are those needs related to the experiences. I also think there's not enough information about reparations. Like, as I said, when we talk about reparations in the US, we immediately think about compensation. And I think there's opportunities for us to share information with survivors and victims so that they are able to make informed decisions about what they need. Finally, I think one of the things, particularly with memorial sites, museums, memory projects, we can contribute to a reparations strategy by undertaking these local level programs. But again, these are not reparations programs. What the government provides is reparations programs. I want to share something that happened in Liberia. So we worked with the Liberian victims doing a body mapping project. And one of the victims, his name was Rufus, and he had a bullet lodged in his buttock and he wasn't able to walk. So he had crutches and his whole right leg was affected. And so he participated in the body mapping project. And then our local partner in Liberia did an exhibition of these body maps. And Rufus, people saw Rufus's story in these body maps. And the big business in Liberia, businessmen, contributed for his surgery. So I would say that's a form of reparations, but again, it's not government. So I think civil society, big business, media can play a parallel role to it, but it needs to be given by the state.
Great, thank you so much. That was very helpful. We'll wrap up now because it is a webinar short. Again, my apologies for the technical problems. This webinar will be in full on our website, and I will also share it with registrants. Thank you so much, Arash. Thank you, Cassidy. We will be back next month with more webinars, so please stay tuned and visit our events page on our website regularly. Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.